So the first thing I want to say is next week is Thanksgiving. The following week is Critique Week. I've scheduled my critique panel so that we can actually meet during Critique Week. So it's an optional class session for you guys, but what we would discuss will be Adorno's foreign and formal music. So it's going to be about post-World War II, 20th century, late modernist, early postmodernist music, since Adorno was in that environment. And it's one of the only pieces that Adorno wrote that had any kind of positive or programmatic character to it. And so it will round out our discussion of music in the course and sort of bring us more into the closer to the contemporary period in terms of actual practices. So that will be on Tuesday the 2nd, December 2nd, so Tuesday after Thanksgiving. And we'll meet here, same time, same place. The files for that are on Canvas. You'll see there's some music selections as well as Adorno's essay. Let's see what else we've got. Oh yeah, we've got a list of the music. As well. But the MP3s I think are there in the folder. All right, so before we get into the selections from Adorno's Aesthetic Theory that we had scheduled to read this time, there's a short piece by Benjamin, yet another short piece by Benjamin that I want to go over with you guys to help inform this concept of mimesis that Benjamin introduces to Adorno and Adorno uses, especially in the selections we read from Aesthetic Theory for this week. Because it's a peculiar one. It's a different theory of mimesis than you'd get elsewhere. It's related to some anthropological theories of mimesis, but it's more specific than that. So let's look at this. So Benjamin writes, nature produces similarities. One need only think of mimicry. The highest capacity for producing similarities, however, is man's. His gift for seeing similarity is nothing but a rudiment of the once powerful compulsion to become similar and to behave mimetically. There is perhaps not a single one of his higher functions in which his mimetic faculty does not play a decisive role. This faculty has a history, however, in both the phylogenetic and the ontogenetic sense, so in terms of origin and development. As regards the latter, play is to a great extent at school. Children's play is everywhere permeated by mimetic modes of behavior, and its realm is by no means limited to what one person can imitate in another person. The child plays at being not only a shopkeeper or a teacher, but also a windmill and a train. Of what use to him is the schooling of his mimetic faculty. So you'll see with the example of the windmill and the train, we would have an anthropomorphism of technology, but also a technologization of the human. So what use to him is the schooling of his mimetic faculty? The answer presupposes an understanding of the phylogenetic significance of the mimetic faculty. Here it is not enough to think of what we understand today by the concept of similarity. As is known, the sphere of life that formerly seemed to be governed by the law of similarity was comprehensive. It ruled both microcosm and macrocosm. But these natural correspondences are given their true importance only if we see that they, one and all, are stimulants and awakeners of the mimetic faculty which answers them in man. It must be borne in mind that neither mimetic powers nor mimetic objects remain the same in the course of thousands of years. Rather, we must suppose that the gift for producing similarities, for example in dances whose oldest function this is, and therefore also the gift of recognizing them, have changed in the course of history. The direction of this change seems determined by the increasing fragility of the mimetic faculty, for clearly the perceptual world of modern man contains only minimal residues of the magical correspondences and analogies that were familiar to ancient peoples. The question is whether we are concerned with the decay of this faculty or its transformation. Of the direction in which the latter might lie, some indications may be derived, even if indirectly, from astrology. We must assume in principle that in the remote past, the processes considered imitable included those in the sky. In dances, on other cultic occasions, such imitation could be produced, such similarity dealt with. But if the mimetic genius was really a life-determining force for the ancients, it is not difficult to imagine that the newborn child was thought to be in full possession of this gift, and in particular to be perfectly adapted to the form of cosmic being. Allusion to the astrological sphere may supply a first reference point for an understanding of the concept of non-sensuous similarity. And this is an important concept. It's the central concept of this piece, non-sensuous similarity. So what does he mean by way of astrology? So I'll use myself as an example. I'm a Virgo. My mother's also a Virgo. So what does that mean? It means I was born under the sign Virgo. I was born under the constellation Virgo. The heavenly bodies forming a certain constellation and whose different elements basically give you the character of a personality. And then because I was born under that sign, then supposedly I'm like the constellation Virgo. My personality, my character is like the constellation Virgo, but not sensuously. I don't look like the constellation Virgo. But somehow I am like the constellation Virgo. So non-sensuous similarity. So where he goes with this. True, our existence no longer includes what once made it possible to speak of this kind of similarity, above all the ability to produce it. Nevertheless, we too possess a canon according to which the meaning of non-sensuous similarity can be at least partly clarified, and this canon is language. Now watch out, so he's going to get into this here. He disagrees with semiotics. He disagrees with the arbitrary relationship between the signified and the signifier, or the conventional relationship between the signified and the signifier. So you have to sort of toss everything you find about that. Why? From time immemorial, the mimetic faculty has been conceded some influence on language. Yet this was done without foundation, without consideration of a further meaning, still less a history of the mimetic faculty. But above all, such considerations remain closely tied to the commonplace, sensuous realm of similarity. All the same, imitated behavior in language formation was acknowledged under the name of onomatopoeia. Now, if language, as is evident to the insightful, is not an agreed-upon system of signs, we will, in attempting to approach language, be constantly obliged to have recourse to the kind of thoughts that appear in their most primitive form as the onomatopoeic mode of explanation. The question is whether this can be developed and adapted to improved understanding. Every word in the whole of language, it has been asserted, is onomatopoetic. It is difficult to conceive in any detail the program that might be implied by this proposition. But the concept of non-sensuous similarity is of some relevance. For if words meaning the same thing in different languages are arranged about that signified as their center, we have to inquire how they all, while often possessing not the slightest similarity to one another, are similar to the signified at their center. Yet this kind of similarity cannot be explained only by the relationships between words meaning the same thing in different languages, Just as in general, our reflection cannot be restricted to the spoken word. They are equally concerned with the written word, and here it is noteworthy that the latter, in some cases more vividly than the spoken word, illuminates, by relation of its written form to the signified, the nature of non-sensuous similarity. In brief, it is non-sensuous similarity that establishes the ties not only between what is said and what is meant, but also between what is written and what is meant, and equally between the spoken and the written. So what he's saying is that the spoken word somehow sounds like the object that it's signifying, but not sensuously, and the written word somehow looks like its object, but non-sensuously, and the spoken word sounds like the written word, but non-sensuously, and the written word looks like the spoken word, but non-sensuously. Graphology has taught us to recognize in handwriting images that the unconscious of the writer conceals in it. It may be supposed that the mimetic process which expresses itself in this way in the activity of the writer was, in the very distant times in which script originated, of utmost importance for writing. Script has thus become like language, an archive of non-sensuous similarities, of non-sensuous correspondences. But this aspect of language, as well as of script, does not develop in isolation from its other semiotic aspect. Rather, the mimetic element in language can, like a flame, manifest itself only through a kind of bearer. This bearer is the semiotic element. Thus, the nexus of meaning of words or sentences is the bearer through which, like a flash, similarity appears. For its production by man, like its perception by him, is in many cases, and particularly the most important, tied to its flashing up. It flits past. It is not improbable that the rapidity of writing and reading heightens the fusion of the semiotic and the mimetic in the sphere of language. So when you're reading, you're seeing the words, you're hearing the words, you're also seeing the objects. All that's happening simultaneously. So you're relating the object, your concept of it, how it sounds non-sensuously, how it looks non-sensuously, and how the spoken and the written form somehow are connected.
Don't human beings have like a range of ability to imagine what they see?
A range?
Yeah, like some people can't imagine visually.
Possibly. Maybe. Yeah. Maybe. Yeah, I know that neurology has tried to nail this stuff down, aesthetics. We're kind of assuming an equality here among people. And here's one thing that he's doing that maybe we can, maybe we can't assume equality on this count, which is synesthesia. Synesthesia? You know what synesthesia is? Yes. So supposedly only some people have synesthetic. Doesn't everyone have synesthetic? No? Don't you see things when you listen to music? That's what synesthesia is. No? You don't see anything when you don't see any forms or colors when you're listening to music? No? Only some? Artists? Imagination? Well, anyway, for the purposes of this course, we're assuming human equality on these faculties. Why? Well, at a biological level, we're not very different from each other. Even though in 2025, we're meant to think that we're very different from each other biologically.
Well, the way that we function is the same, but the amount to which we function in different ways varies.
Yeah, so it would be a difference in degree, not of kind.
Yeah.
Okay. Which would also raise the question of whether one can develop these kind of possible faculties. You know, whether the faculties are just once and for all, or whether our faculties are potentialities that can develop in individuals depending on their experience.
Nothing in the brain is purely nature or purely nature.
Right. We rewire ourselves, to use the parlance of contemporary science. One thing that I'll say about science, and it bears on what Benjamin's getting at here. So why does Benjamin say that there isn't an arbitrary or conventional, agreed upon relationship between the signified and the signifier? Because there's a historical relationship between the signified and the signifier. Right, so he wants there to be, that's why he talks about a canon and an archive. There's a history. These things have not remained the same in thousands of years. There's been a development. There's a history. So there's a transformation of our faculties across history. There's a realization of possibility and potential across history. At least that's the idea. Okay. So, everything we've been talking about in this course from the beginning, from Kant, has been disputed, rejected, argued against. It's all been denied. Freedom. People definitely deny freedom, for sure. At every level, right? They deny free will. They deny free will. Everything that we do is supposedly determined. Free will is an illusion. When we think we've chosen an action, we've already chosen it, and then our consciousness catches up with that decision, and we have the illusion of making the choice. You haven't heard about this? Some of you have?
Yeah.
Yes? We have to think, why do we tell these fairy tales to ourselves? Because they are fairy tales. Whatever we think of science today, in the future people will look back and say, why did they believe that? The way we look back and wonder why people believe what they believe. We have to hold out hope that people in the future will think that we're backward. Because we are backward. It's a society that slaughters millions of people a year in ridiculous wars that accomplish nothing. We're backward.
That hasn't changed.
It's changed. It's gotten worse. Right? So, because this is really the point. The point is to introduce history and the possibility of transformation. To read what was never written. Such reading is the most ancient, reading prior to all languages. From entrails, the stars, or dances. Later, the mediating link of a new kind of reading, of runes and hieroglyphs, came into use. It seems fair to suppose that these were the stages by which the mimetic gift, formerly the foundation of occult practices, gained admittance to writing and language. In this way, language may be seen as the highest level of mimetic behavior and the most complete archive of non-sensuous similarity, a medium into which the earlier powers of mimetic production and comprehension have passed without residue, to the point where they have liquidated those of magic. So he uses this language of the occult and magic. So what is that referring to? That's referring to, again, anthropological categories. So religion and magic, the cultic, the religious, the occult, the magical. These are basic anthropological categories, meaning all cultures throughout history have had religion, and they've also had magic. Now, we haven't really talked about this very much in the course. We've got into it a bit with Nietzsche, with The Birth of Tragedy. We've certainly been talking about it from Hegel and Nietzsche. Religion, art, philosophy. One thing that we also discussed was science. Nietzsche's notion of science, but also Hegel's notion of science. So science, knowledge aware of its own conditions of possibility. Wissenschaft, that's the German word for science. But also science in the more empirical sense and the more practical sense that we're familiar with. right? Like, so there's the kind of philosophical notion of science, but then there's the way we use the word science. And science has a very long history. And art is distinct, according to Nietzsche, from both philosophy and science. We talked about this in terms of subjective truth, objective truth. And so we have a range from the subjective to the objective, and where art comes from. So art comes from the cultic, art comes from religion, but art also comes from the magical. And science comes from the magical too. Right, do you know that Sir Isaac Newton wrote more on alchemy than he did on physics? Because of course for him alchemy was science. Science is magic. Magic is science. The difference between magic and religion is that where religion is about the veneration and worship of the divine forces, magic is about our attempt to manipulate them. And that's why magic always has, in all cultures, magic is associated with potential evil. Because it's a profanation of the sacred. Again, sacred and profane as basic anthropological categories, cultic versus occult, religion versus magic. And science comes from magic, whereas philosophy comes from religion, comes from theology. Art comes from religion and theology, but art also comes from magic. So what are people doing when they're mimicking things? They are participating in the divine forces of the universe by imitating them, but they're also trying to affect them. Right, so the mimetic is about changing the object and changing the subject. Transformation of both the mimetic subject and the mimetic object. Imitating not only a shopkeeper or a teacher, but a windmill and a train. So, that transformative process, so words, language, also were thought to have some relation to the divine powers of the universe. So magic, you could say something and affect things. Ancient peoples would keep their true names secret. Only their closest relatives would know their true names, because if someone knew your true name, they could cast a spell on you. Oh, you haven't heard of this stuff? Never heard of that? Oh no. Yeah, you're not supposed to, and when you cut your fingernails and cut your hair, you're supposed to like bury it so that a magician can't get a hold of it, because otherwise they can cast a spell on you. Oh yeah. Oh yeah. Mm-hmm.
So, in terms of like using more it's like, especially in the letter, like all the alchemy obsession, so definitely this sort of framework of magic seems appropriate, this sort of nascent scientific sort of knowledge system. But like at the same time, I'm not sure, it seems like religion, like the theological element is there too. Like, Newton's like laws of motion, right? Like, an object at rest stays at rest. That's a prime mover of God, right? The second law, object in motion continues in motion. It's the universe continuing in its motion. And the third law kind of compromises how that works. The mover manages to keep it moving with momentum. So like it's all very theological.
Can you have a living God in a dead universe?
Right.
No, you can't. So you know Stephen Hawking, theory of everything? No, Stephen Hawking, theory of everything. A lot of people trying to reconcile quantum mechanics and the theory of relativity. So, he's a popularizer as well. He was a real scientist, but also a popularizer. Said science is the attempt to understand the mind of God. Okay. Except religion, you're not meant to ever understand the mind of God. It remains a mystery. So the attempt to understand the mind of God, but it eludes us. So the issue of like violating these things. So why art and language? That's why language shouldn't be understood, and art certainly shouldn't be understood as merely communicative or representational. So everything that we've got running around education, I was educated the same way you guys were. Theories of representation, theories of language, semiotics. Ew. It like gets rid of everything, all the juicy stuff. It gets rid of all the substantial stuff. It gets rid of everything, including history. Right? It sort of leaves us in this ahistorical, atemporal place.
Boils it down to something that doesn't have history.
Sure, yeah. Or we could say without spirit, without Geist. Yeah, absolutely. So, you know, ancient peoples like medieval Europe, you could be killed for saying the wrong thing, blasphemy, or for making the wrong image, also blasphemy. But you would not necessarily suffer from the state if you murdered someone. The person's family would have to take care of that justice. Right? So things that we consider to be serious crimes would not have been considered a crime, and things that we don't think are very effectual would be considered high crimes. If you can't say the wrong thing, you can't make the wrong image, you can't make the wrong gesture. You can't make the wrong gesture because of magic and because of the danger of blasphemy. So where does art fit into all of that? Because we are talking about the freedom of art. So we're talking about art transcending its cultic origins, transcending propaganda and entertainment, transcending the rituals of the religion and of the aristocracy. But we're also talking about not just transcending those things and freedom from those values, but also freedom in a more profound sense. Meaning, we both treat art as a kind of religious, cultic function, and also as a magical function, even though we also think that it's not either of those things. So recall Susan Buckmorse from the first week of class. She was very much influenced by Benjamin and Adorno. She said, the freedom of expression of artists is now defended on the basis of the virtuality of the image. The idea is that art has no effect, and so that's why we allow artists to be free, to do whatever they want, because we just assume, well, of course, art doesn't change anything. Benjamin and Adorno don't think that. They don't think that. They think that art can participate in changing things. It can change things. Art, at a very basic level, the experience of art changes the subject, changes an individual's faculties. Meaning you can have an aesthetic education through art. You can develop your faculties through the experience of art, through the experience of art literature. It was meant to change you. Listening to a piece of music was supposed to change you. Reading a novel was supposed to change you. Looking at a painting was supposed to change you. Otherwise, there was no point to it. There's no point to art unless it was possible for it to affect people, to transform them. Not just to play on certain established keys, but to provide an experience of the new and the different. And to change our ability to experience the new and the different. Right, so the idea is that ancient peoples knew this in a way that we don't, or we've lost sight of. Meaning ancient peoples strictly controlled the use of language and images. because they understood their power. Whereas we've lost a sense of that. So we know that these things are powerful, they're affecting, but we've lost the ability to really grasp how and why that's the case. So I think that I mentioned to you guys that with Adorno, the big controversy of his time, as an adult, starting in the 1930s and all the way up through the 60s. So he died in 1969. The big issue, especially for someone who considers himself to be a Marxist, like Adorno did, is socialist realism and the repression of art and literature in the East Bloc and the supposedly Marxist-led communist world and the actually existing socialist states. Serious repression. So artists would be jailed or put in psychiatric hospitals or tortured and killed. Their works would certainly be banned, suppressed, but artists themselves. Whereas here, of course, artists are just free to starve. So that's how they take care of artists here. They don't have to put them in jail or a psychiatric hospital or destroy the work, or sometimes that happens here too. But generally it's sufficient to just allow the artists to starve. Right, let the market take care of that. The state doesn't have to. Right, but this is an issue, meaning art has stakes, but it seems very difficult for us to grasp the actual stakes of art. Art was part of the Cold War. The West claimed to be free by virtue of modernism. The fact that it didn't repress modernism, that it didn't repress the avant-garde, whereas it was repressed in the East, and that showed that the East was unfree, whereas the West was free.
But you're talking about it in like a centralized way, where like if that were absolutely true, then artists wouldn't be making art. But they are. They do.
Sure, people still make art, of course. I mean, obviously.
And it's not because the government supports us, it's because we're supported by the smaller communities that see what we do and that benefit from what we do.
Yeah. Civil society takes care of art. In the United States, educational institutions like this one, most educational institutions are private, not state, not public. And galleries and museums are private institutions. They're not state institutions. Yes, that's true. This is liberal. This is liberal democracy, liberal society, something, right? So civil society takes care of it. But there's still this question of, okay, so artists make their way in civil society freely on the marketplace of ideas and practices. However, there still is a fraught relationship between art and life. There still is.
I think also that this hard boundary that we're imagining between like the market and the state is not real. Like the CIA was working through
To manipulate the market.
through magazines, that were like.
They probably still do.
Of course. So,
Because USAID was. They certainly were.
There's both.
Oh, yeah. I mean, look, obviously the state is connected to the market in a place like the United States. It's a capitalist state. So, but, yeah, it's not a hard boundary, no. But, again, the question of artistic freedom, the stakes of artistic freedom, the stakes of aesthetic autonomy, right? The stakes of autonomous artworks as opposed to heteronymous artworks, right? So artists, remember again Susan Buck-Morse, artists can be producers of visual culture, right? So you can become a cultural producer as opposed to an artist, and what she says is artists may choose to do their work underground, meaning there would be the work that you make to get paid, to make a living, and then there'd be the work that you make because you think it's important, but you know that it won't get you the support that you need to survive,
But
right?
if art changes the subject, then making art that compromises your relationship to it will further alienate your relationship to it in a genuine way.
Absolutely, right? So we understand that heteronymous art is somehow not quite art. In other words, if you are compelled to make it for the market or for the state, we understand that it's not really authentic as art. Right? So, again, we read this last week from Adorno, aesthetic autonomy cannot be revoked. Right? It's there, it can be suppressed, repressed, but it can't really be revoked. Again, that's why they had to do what they did in the communist countries. They had to use very drastic measures because they knew that repression would not be organic entirely, and they knew that the genie was out of the bottle. You can't really try to put the genie back into the bottle. You can, and you can say, oh, we only have to repress for one generation until everyone's a communist. Yeah, it never ends because it's irrevocable. We can't go back to the way people did it in the Middle Ages. No. Not least because our faculties have changed, our faculties have transformed. Or at least that's the idea. Again, rather optimistically, that would be the idea. All right, so we're looking at enigmaticalness, truth, content, metaphysics. That's our first selection. All right, so truth content. Let's talk about that idea because it's a tricky Hegelian idea. Truth content. So truth content. The truth content of something can be, often is, actually simply is the opposite of it. So it's a very peculiar idea. So this is what both Hegel did and now Adorno is going to do with this opposition of art and society. So we set it up in the readings that we did last week, which is that society is the truth content of art and art is the truth content of society. But what that means is that they actually have a negative relationship to each other. So the truth of something is expressed by its opposite. To get back to the state and the market, Hegel had this idea that the state is the truth of civil society, even though it seems to contradict civil society. And civil society is the truth of the state, even though it seems to contradict the state. Right, it does seem like the freedom of civil society is different than the coercive character or compulsion of the state. And yet, for Hegel, each was the truth of the other. So we'll see how this plays out, meaning we have to deal with this more concretely, contextually in the instances. But that's what that concept means, and so it's a very peculiar concept. It also means, as we discussed with the immanent dialectical critique of phenomena, that things transform historically, practices transform historically, art has transformed historically through a series of self-overcomings, self-transformations that take on the character of both a realization and an abolition. So art has been continuing by transforming, and it's been transforming by abolishing and reinventing itself over and over again. We did look at the Trotsky, right? The Art and Politics in Our Epoch, right? So art as a protest against reality. Art is a protest against reality. but also the succession of different art movements are broken off before reaching a full fruition, before realizing their potential. And alternating between hope and despair, more and more radical attempts at revolutionizing art. And that's a pretty good characterization of art history up through the 60s when Adorno is writing. Since the 60s, less so. Since the 60s, less so. Art's been a lot more neutralized since the 60s. So in the 60s, they were having happenings, there was Fluxus. I forget when the dude shot himself as a performance. It's like Chris Burton. Yeah, when was that? 70s maybe? 70s, yeah. So 70s is a little hangover from the 60s. 70s is when the 60s went like berserk until like Thatcher and Reagan calmed everybody down in the 80s. I guess there's a little bit of trickle into the 80s, right? But generally speaking,
1971.
71, right? So a year after I was born. So yeah, that sounds about 71. That sounds about invasion of Cambodia, something or other. Yeah. We're just not doing that kind of thing anymore.
What?
We're not doing that kind of thing anymore.
Good old days of shooting ourselves.
The good old days. No, now we don't. We just shoot ourselves, but not in the name of art. Right, we simply shoot ourselves. We don't try to redeem it as art. Yeah, children don't do that for either reason. So that process of radical alternation between hope and despair, radical revolutionizing, radical self-negation of art petered out in my lifetime.
I don't know if it petered out or just like the market since the 80s has become remarkable in its ability to recuperate almost immediately. Like beginning with like the 3D street art, like marginalized identities are in the gallery now. It's immediately neoliberal, with Paul and this kind of stuff. There's initial moments of rupture, it's just that they get captured almost immediately. It's not that like no one's radical anymore. It's not that there's no radical.
Nobody's radical anymore. I will definitely say nobody's radical anymore. No, they're not radical like that. Not like Fluxus, not like that stuff. No, nobody's doing that.
But the definition of radical needs to change because the time is changing.
Most certainly. What I'm saying is, I don't know that artists try.
It's so simple.
I was about to say the opposite. I think
Do they try?
They're trying so hard.
But do
And
they
it's
do
a
this kind
failure.
of stuff?
Hmm?
Do they do that kind of stuff? Like
They're
Fluxus type
trying
stuff?
to.
Really?
I think they're really trying to. But to your point, none of it seems effective, and there's a lack of imagination for what could achieve that kind of radicality.
Yeah, I think it's a harder environment to try to do that stuff in because it's more constrained and controlled. Like the neoliberal art period that we've been in since the 1980s and still in now is a very like top-heavy, top-down.
Ever since Andy Warhol, it's all gone to shit.
Well, I bring that up because I struggle that, the sense that everyone is trying and grasping and why.
I'm not saying people don't make art. People still make art. But it's within a more circumscribed parameter. I mean, I did art. I was MFA. I had an art career. And, I didn't do, that kind of avant-gardism that completely blurs the distinction between art and life. No. I mean, what did we have? Relational aesthetics. That didn't last very long. And that was all in the gallery, meaning it was all art. Right? How radical was that?
I think it's.
And it was pad thai by a Thai artist. How radical was that?
It's more.
I mean, at least it should have been lasagna or something.
But just
by a
there's
Thai
not
artist.
on the track.
Right.
not a matter of wanting to try, it's whether we can. It's whether or not it happens. It has nothing to do with trying. It happens if it can, and it doesn't if it can't.
That would be tautologically true. That's true. I'm not sure that it's because it's not allowed. I don't think it's forbidden. I think it doesn't even occur to us.
How much of that sort of boundary breaking just feels like passé now?
Feels passé. Maybe it was passé. I mean, certainly Adorno treats it as kind of like
Just kind of uninteresting, but what sort of new way is there to do that thing?
Good question. Good question.
Because the language of being radical needs to be more convoluted because the environment is more convoluted.
The 60s ruined everything. Just remember that. 60s ruined everything. Meaning they pulled up the ladder behind them. They did what they did, and then they institutionalized it, and they were like, "You don't go any further than this."
I don't know. I see that as being like a little bit like victim blaming. Like I think
Victims?
Yeah.
They weren't victims like we are. No way.
The left didn't like arrogantly just like pull the ladder up after itself or whatever. It was like soundly defeated by like a new regime of policing and militarism that emerged.
Which was that same generation 20 years later.
What's that?
Same
Was
generation.
The same generation doing that just 20 years later.
No, I don't think like members of Fluxus became like cops in the 1980s.
They did not. No. I'm not saying that. And also there would be a difference between the artists and the left. Left is basically Philistine. That's the other problem, is that the political left is pretty Philistine. But yeah, kind of the feeling that it's all been done before.
Well, but take for instance like a recent attempt by artists here, local, to like do something more radical than just
Chicago or SAAC?
Here, Chicago, when they tried, when a couple of semesters ago, I wasn't here yet, but they tried to take the garden and do like a Palestinian anti-genocide encampment. It lasted all but 2 hours or something because the cops came.
5 minutes,
and heads and throwing people in vehicles. Like, it's not that.
That's not art, though.
What's that?
That's not art.
It also doesn't.
That's not art. Sorry.
No, it doesn't really do much.
It's politics, and it was politics, a political demonstration.
Fluxus is politics, right? Like,
Yeah, but it was art too. Like, it definitely was art. Like harassing the coyote behind the tarp, the weird sled. It was art.
I think that if the encampments were able to fry more than like 5 seconds, I think hundreds of artists in that space over time, you would have very quickly seen artistic interventions taking root. But
Possibly.
it doesn't happen in 5 minutes,
No, possibly. I mean, Occupy Wall Street also didn't try to do much culturally or artistically, and they were there for a while. Also, the Squares movement in the Caribbean.
I don't know. I'm not sure if I think it's a difference between trying and succeeding that we're talking about. Like Occupy Chicago, we had the building and over on Canal Street, all kinds of programming was going on for months and months.
Yeah, I was there.
But what happened is the building was infiltrated by undercovers, and it all just turned into a scandal and a terrorism case. So it collapsed, but it didn't collapse without months of like artistic, cultural, cooking together, all everything you think of.
But again, that's not art. It really isn't art. Like, it seriously is not art. Like, in other words, I am saying that, remember my role? I'm the attorney for Adorno, making my case for Adorno, my client. Right? Adorno would say it's not art. We have to consider that maybe it's not art. In other words, that maybe everything isn't art, and that's okay.
Some of those things were art.
They were aesthetical. They had an aesthetic component. But art, fine art, let's go back to Hegel, fine art, as opposed to applied art. There's such a thing.
Yeah, the stuff for mummies to worry about.
Stuff for mummies to worry about?
Do you think Fluxus was worried about that distinction?
It was fine art. It wasn't applied art. They weren't designing iPhones. Right.
Nobody's talking about designing iPhones. Like, we were making, like, beautifully crafted, artistic, like, shields to fight the cops for NATO something, we were making iPhones, I'm sure.
Did we talk about that? I'm trying to think of whether we talked about that. Did we talk about the Art Institute has funny objects there, right? Like medieval armor. Why is that in the museum, in the Art Institute Museum? Medieval armor. Hmm? Right, so they're there to be considered aesthetically. They do have an aesthetic, everything has an aesthetic component. It's not like anything is without an aesthetic aspect. But they're clearly not works of fine art. They weren't religious art. So what were they? They were the fusion of aesthetics and war. They were the fusion of aesthetics and politics. They were the fusion of, meaning their beauty was inseparable from their kick-ass military value, right? So they were meant to either deflect swords and arrows, or they were meant to dazzle their opponent and contribute to the defeat through physical combat of their opponents, right? Native Americans painted their bodies when going into war. Why? Not to look a certain way. It wasn't a fine art performance. It was to help win the battle. Right? So, and maybe to psych themselves up too, but to win the battle, right? So everything is aesthetic, but that still doesn't make it art. And certainly not capital A art and not fine art. Certainly not. Right?
Let's take the case of the armor that's across the street. Like, a lot of that is not actually combat armor. A lot of that is ceremonial gear, like ceremonial ritualistic stuff, which
Some of it is, yeah.
Which then goes to like the function of glory.
Yeah.
And it's the same function that painting served in the same time period.
Yes.
So they're kind of in the same category.
Painting for the aristocracy, that's right. In other words, it was part of the ritual values of the aristocracy. What we would now consider to be more recognizably fine art. Well, maybe art didn't exist until it separated itself from those ritual values. And now we might re-merge them, art, back into ritual values. Again, that's the Susan Buck-Morse point, meaning artists can become cultural producers. They can do just socially useful things, and then their value in terms of what they care about in terms of their artistic practice will be driven underground. It will be sort of stylistic or formalistic things that fly under the radar in the cultural production, or it will be done just for them and their friends. Right? So, because again, liquidating the category of art as we've known it. Remember that phrase that she had? A discourse of visual culture liquidates art as we've known it. Liquidates means resubmerges back into. So, okay, maybe that's happened. And she was writing in the 90s. She was writing at the same time I was an MFA student here. And I think I told you guys that my video department was very political. It was Marxist. And they didn't like my work because it was too arty. And I'm getting my revenge by teaching Adorno at the Art Institute. Payback. For real. Because I was reading Adorno's Aesthetic Theory in order to maintain my sanity in the face of this Marxist criterion that my work should not be so arty. And I was like, deal with this. The task of aesthetics is not to comprehend artworks as hermeneutical objects, meaning as hermeneutics is literally like hidden meaning, like sort of interpretation, hidden meaning. In the contemporary situation, it is their incomprehensibility that needs to be comprehended. What is so resistlessly absorbed as a cliche by the watchword, the absurd, could only be recuperated by a theory that thinks it's truth. It cannot simply be divided off from the spiritualization of artworks as counterpoint to that spiritualization. So, what does it mean to say that art has become absurd? Or there was even absurdism. There was even like absurdism as an art movement. So one would have to think, okay, why did art become absurd? How did it become absurd? How did that become the new value of art? Because that really happened starting after World War I, or in and after World War I, and then after World War II. So spiritualization of artworks, geistigization of artworks, as counterpoint to that. Right, so there's artworks spiritualization versus what's going on in the rest of reality. It is spirit itself in its omnipresence and not the intention of the enigma, right, enigmaticalness. Meaning, art's not trying to be enigmatic, but it is enigmatic. Even when it's trying not to be enigmatic, it's enigmatic. Okay, so what is this omnipresence of spirit? So let's unpack this a little bit. So truth content, the opposite. So art, opposite of society, the truth of society. What is society from Adorno's point of view? It's capitalism. It's capitalism. In other words, what has happened to the spiritual? It's become capitalism. Capitalism is the Geist. Capital is the Geist. Capitalism is what is spiritual. The spirit of our time is capitalism. And yet that seems to completely violate everything that one associates with this term geistic and spiritual. Why? Because capitalism is domination, capitalism is unfreedom. Geist is supposed to be freedom. Okay, so where does this come from? The Marxist approach to capitalism is that capitalism is freedom. It's freedom and it's unfreedom. It's self-contradictory freedom. It is freedom. It's alienated freedom. So when art tries to negate that alienated freedom, it creates this enigma, which is to say, is art trying to be the opposite of freedom? Maybe. We started last week with late 19th, early 20th century. Artists can literally do whatever they want, and yet they try to impose order on themselves. Did we look at those 20s? We did look at those 20s. The 60s, yeah, the 60s nostalgia for the 20s, and Adorno saying it seems like everything was possible in the 20s, the Weimar Republic, the Roaring 20s, the Flappers, right? Sexual liberation after World War I, seemed like everything was possible. And yet it seemed to bring the repressive order down on itself, whether in the form of Nazism or in the form of Stalinism or in the form of Philistinism and liberal democracy. And so, again, a kind of a paradox, because it not only came from outside, he said it was not like the conquistadors swooping in on Mexico and Peru. It wasn't like that. It came from within, including the artists themselves. The artists changed. The pre-World War I, the same artists before World War I, practice differently after World War I. They become more systematic. They're less free in their practice. Right, so why are they doing that? Right? Is that recuperated? Is that like mimicking capitalism, or is it also its own way of rejecting capitalism or opposing capitalism? Meaning, in comparison to the freedom of capitalism, art's going to become disciplined. Or in response to the discipline of capitalism, art is going to be, bohemian rebellion. It alternates. It moves in both directions. For in that it negates the spirit that dominates nature. That's a very tricky phrase here, dominates nature. When we hear that, we hear like, oh, industry destroying the natural environment. Actually, that's not what it means. So, the spirit that dominates nature, not the spirit that frees nature, the dialectic of nature and spirit, but the spirit that dominates nature, the spirit that is dominated by nature also, that dominates nature and is dominated by nature. Then we have to recall what nature means. It should be capital N nature. But Robert Hewlett Cantor, who did the translation, is a hippy-dippy, and I know him very well. So he, of course, wants to face that difference between nature and nature. Nature is history. Nature is society. Nature is culture. So in capitalism, here's what Marx said about capitalism: the present is dominated by the past. So spirit, progress in consciousness of freedom, liberation from history, redemption of history, we talked about that with the theologico-political fragment, becomes instead subordination to the past. So in trying to negate the spirit that dominates nature and that is dominated by nature, the spirit of artworks does not appear as spirit. It ignites on what it is opposed to it, on materiality. In no way is spirit most present in the most spiritual artworks. Art is redemptive in the act by which the spirit in it throws itself away. Art holds true to the shudder, but not by regression to it. Here's another term that he uses, shudder. So shudder, if we think in almost mechanical terms, in terms of like the Industrial Revolution, like when something shudders, it's because there's like a force and a resistance to the force, right? So it's like things moving at two different speeds will cause a shudder, or things moving in opposite directions will produce a shudder. So there's like physical idea of the shudder, but there's also the psychological notion of the shudder. The psychological notion of shudder where we experience something as uncanny. Right? So the familiar becomes unfamiliar. The unfamiliar appears as strangely familiar. Right? The shudder. Rather, art is its legacy, the legacy of the shudder. It imitates, it reproduces the shudder. The spirit of artworks produces the shudder by externalizing it in objects. So I think we talked about this a bit. So after Kant, then art in the Romantic era, and then continuing in the Modernist era, becomes as concerned with the sublime as with the beautiful. And the sublime changes its character because the sublime was meant to be the fearful and not the terrifying. Rather, the sublime becomes the terrifying. So we looked at Baudelaire and the way he described it, that it's not the sympathetic resonance of subject and object in the beautiful, but it's the antagonism, the combat between subject and object, between the artist and his material. And so externalizing it in objects means that the artwork has a different character than it did for Kant, than in the bourgeois ideal of the artwork. So the bourgeois ideal of the artwork is that the artwork is like another subject, is like another free subject, another autonomous subject. No, now the artwork is like another heteronymous subject, like another heteronymous object, meaning the artist feels themselves to be an object, not a subject, and that is externalized in the work. Right, so the work instantiates alienation, it instantiates reification, it instantiates this reduction of the subject into an object, but also as a protest against it. Thus, art participates in the actual movement of history in accord with the law of enlightenment, by virtue of the self-reflection of genius. Genius just means originality. What once seemed to be reality emigrates into imagination, where it survives by becoming conscious of its own unreality. The historical trajectory of art as spiritualization is that of the critique of myth, as well as that towards its redemption. The imagination confirms the possibilities of what it recollects. Okay, so generally, again, the bourgeois notion of art is that art moves from myth to enlightenment. It allows us to become self-conscious. But it also, therefore, redeems myth. So if myth is about unfreedom and enlightenment is about freedom, it still redeems that unfreedom. And so how does that happen? The imagination confirms the possibilities of what it recollects, meaning the present unlocks the possibilities of the past. It frees the past from what it was. This double movement of spirit in art describes its proto-history, which is inscribed in its concept rather than its empirical history. The uncheckable movement of spirit toward what has eluded it becomes in art the voice that speaks for what was lost and the most distantly archaic. Mimesis in art is the pre-spiritual. It is contrary to spirit and yet also that on which spirit ignites. In artwork, spirit has become their principle of construction, although it fulfills its telos only when it emerges from what is to be constructed, from the mimetic impulses, by shaping itself to them rather than allowing itself to be imposed on them by sovereign rule. Okay, let's unpack that. Constellation, that's an important concept. Construction. So construction and constellation are kind of complementary ideas. So constellation is how things seem to spontaneously appear, but then the artwork constructs that. Right, so it tries to imitate that spontaneity through a construction. So it tries to have the same character as a spontaneous constellation, but through what is obviously a construction. Right, so in constructing, we imitate, but in imitating, we change. So what was spontaneously the case in nature, by imitating it, it becomes a construction. And so, again, what was unfree in nature becomes free by virtue of imitating it and constructing it. So this is, again, the old platitudes like art is the imitation of nature, or art is the mirror of nature, art imitates life. Yes, but maybe freedom only becomes freedom when it's constructed rather than when it simply spontaneously appears. So in artwork, spirit has become their principle of construction, although it fulfills its telos only when it emerges from what is to be constructed. Form objectivates the particular impulses only when it follows them where they want to go of their own accord. This alone is the effexis of artworks in reconciliation. So, again, realizing a potential in the spontaneous that can only be realized by constructing it. by itself, it doesn't realize its potential. Did we talk about entity and identity? I think that we did talk about that. We talked about entity and identity, what is entity and what becomes identical to itself, what becomes self-identical. Meaning an entity, when reconstructed in an artwork, attains a self-identity that it wouldn't have in mere nature, in mere existence. So by imitating what exists, it's given an identity that it didn't otherwise and wouldn't otherwise have. Right? It transforms the object. The rationality of our works becomes spirit only when it is immersed in its polar opposite. The divergence of the constructive and the mimetic, which no artwork can resolve and which is virtually the original sin of aesthetic spirit, has its correlative in that element of the ridiculous and clownish that even the most significant works bear, and that unconcealed is inextricable from their significance. All right, so original sin of aesthetic spirit. All right, so I think that we talked about this when we talked about the theological political fragment and the redemption. So original sin is freedom. It's knowledge and freedom. So it's the free choice to disobey God and eat from the forbidden tree of knowledge. Right, so freedom is where we get knowledge from. Knowledge is where we get freedom from. But freedom and knowledge are the original sin that we have to constantly pay for. So the original sin of the aesthetic spirit, so what does that mean? So the original sin of the aesthetic spirit is that the aesthetic spirit allows us to become conscious of our aesthetic experience. It also allows us to be free in our aesthetic experience, to construct it, as opposed to just having it. And yet, by imitating what is otherwise spontaneous, it becomes ridiculous and clownish, or absurd, as he mentioned earlier. And that, in fact, it can't be significant and important unless it's also ridiculous and clownish. The inadequacy of classicism, of any persuasion, originates in its repression of this element. So it represses the ridiculous or the clownish. A repression that art must mistrust. The progressive spiritualization of art in the name of maturity only accentuates the ridiculous all the more glaringly. The more the artwork's own organization assimilates itself to a logical order by virtue of its inner exactitude, the more obviously the difference between the artwork's logicity and the logicity that governs empirically becomes the parity of the latter. The more reasonable the work becomes in terms of its formal constitution, the more ridiculous it becomes according to the standard of empirical reason. Its ridiculousness is, however, also part of the condemnation of empirical rationality. It accuses the rationality of social praxis of having become an end in itself, and as such the irrational and mad reversal of means into ends. Okay, so this is the basic Marxist idea about capitalism, is that in capitalism, what should be a means becomes an end in itself. So capital is meant to be a means to an end, it becomes an end in itself. And social praxis, which is meant to serve humanity and freedom, it serves its own logic. The ridiculous in art, which Philistines recognize better than do those who are naively at home in art, and the folly of a rationality made absolute, that's capitalism, indict one another reciprocally. Incidentally, when viewed from the perspective of the praxis of self-preservation, happiness, sex, is equally ridiculous, as can be spitefully pointed out by anyone who is not driven by it. Ridiculousness is the residue of the mimetic in art, the price of its self-enclosure. In his condemnation of this element, the Philistine always has an ignominious measure of justification. The ridiculous is a barbaric residuum of something alien to form, misfires in art if art fails to reflect and shape it. Now, we talked about the difference in barbarism and savagery. So savagery is like without culture, barbarism is decadent culture. Okay, so it's an Enlightenment 18th century idea. The idea is that the savages are noble, whereas European civilization has become barbaric. So, again, when society has become barbaric, if it remains on the level of the childish and is taken for such, it merges with the calculated fun of the culture industry. By its very concept, art implies kitsch, just as the obligation it imposes of sublimating the ridiculous. It presupposes educational privilege and class structure. Fun is art's punishment for this. All the same, the ridiculous elements in our works are most akin to their intentionless levels, and therefore in great works also closest to their secret. Foolish subjects, like those in the Magic Flute and their Freischütz, have more truth content through the medium of the music than does the Ring, Wagner, which gravely aims at the ultimate. In its clownishness, art consolingly recollects prehistory in the primordial world of animals. Apes in the zoo together perform what resembles clown routines. The collusion of children with clowns is a collusion with art, which adults drive out of them just as they drive out their collusion with animals. Human beings have not so succeeded in so thoroughly repressing their likeness to animals that they are unable in an instant to recapture it and be flooded with joy. The language of little children and animals seems to be the same. In the similarity of clowns to animals, the likeness of humans to apes flashes up. The constellation animal, fool, clown is a fundamental layer of art. So just as a little anticipation of what we'll be talking about in 2 weeks during Critique Week, I want to, there's another piece by Adorno. And that's the fetish character in music and the regression of listening. It's really the end. We'll look at the beginning during Critique Week. We'll look at this in more detail during Critique Week. So, this is from the 1930s. This is something we're in the 30s. Fetish character in music just means the commodity character of music, and regression of listening means the psychological regression of music and of the aesthetic, what he was talking about there with the childish. In the face of regressive listening, music as a whole begins to take on a comic aspect. One need only listen to the uninhibited sonority of a choral rehearsal from outside. This experience was caught with great force in a film by the Marx Brothers, who demolished an opera set as if to clothe in allegory the insight of the philosophy of history on the decay of the operatic form, or in a most estimable piece of refined entertainment, break up a grand piano in order to take possession of its strings in their frame as the true harp of the future on which to play a prelude. Music has become comic in the present phase, primarily because something so completely useless is carried on with all the visible signs of the strain of serious work. By being alien to solid people, music reveals their alienation from one another, and the consciousness of alienation vents itself in laughter. In music, or similarly in lyric poetry, the society which judged them comic becomes comic. But involved in this laughter is the decay of the sacral spirit of reconciliation. All music today can very easily sound as Parsifal did to Nietzsche's ear. It recalls incomprehensible rites and surviving masks from an earlier time and is provocative nonsense. The radio, which both wears out music and overexposes it, makes a major contribution to this. Perhaps a better hour may at some time strike even for the clever fellows, one in which they may demand, instead of prepared material ready to be switched on, the improvisatory displacement of things as the sort of radical beginning that can only thrive under the protection of the unshaken real world. Even discipline can take over the expression of free solidarity if freedom becomes its content. As little as regressive listening is a symptom of progressing consciousness of freedom, it could suddenly turn around if art, in unity with the society, should ever leave the road of the always identical. Just to illustrate that a little bit. Finally, we'll look at this paragraph, and then we'll take a break and come back and look at you guys' notes. As a thing that negates the world of things, every artwork is a priori helpless when it is called on to legitimate itself to this world. Still, art cannot simply refuse the demand for legitimation by pointing to this a priority. It is hard to be astonished by art's enigmaticalness if it is taken neither as a source of pleasure, as it is for those alien to art, nor as an exceptional realm, as it is for the connoisseur, but as the substance of personal experience. Yet this substance demands that the elements of art not be abandoned, but secured when art is fundamentally challenged by its experience. An inkling of this is had when artworks are experienced in so-called cultural contexts that are alien or incommensurable to them. In these situations, artworks are displayed naked to the test of their cui bono, or who benefits, a test from which they are protected only by the leaky roof of their own familiar context. In such situations, the disrespectful question, which ignores the taboo surrounding the aesthetic zone, often becomes fateful to the quality of the work. Observed completely externally, the artwork's dubiousness is uncovered as relentlessly as when they are observed completely internally. The enigmaticalness of artworks remains bound up with history. It was through history that they became an enigma. It is history that ever and again makes them such, and conversely it is history alone which gave them their authority, that holds at a distance the embarrassing question of their reason for existence. The enigmaticalness of artworks is less their irrationality than their rationality. The more methodically they are ruled, the more sharply their enigmaticalness is thrown into relief. Through form, artworks gain their resemblance to language, seeming at every point to say just this and only this, and at the same time, whatever it is slips away. All right, let's take a short break, and then we'll come back and discuss the notes. So let's resume. Let's look at the next paragraph here, and then we'll get into the questions and the passages that you guys cited in your notes. All our works and art altogether are enigmas. Since antiquity, this has been an irritation to the theory of art. That our works say something and in the same breath conceal it expresses this enigmaticalness from the perspective of language. This characteristic cavorts clownishly if one is within the artwork, if one participates in its imminent completion, this enigmaticalness makes itself invisible. If one steps outside the work, breaking the contract with its imminent context, this enigmaticalness returns like a spirit. All right, that's an important idea, by the way, that it's just sort of throwing in there. The idea that it's in our experience of the work that we complete the work. meaning the work really only happens, it only really exists in our experience of it. And yet it can also appear to be completely self-contained, existing on its own, and existing independently of us. But in fact, it's only really completed or realized in the experience of it. Says this gives further reason for the study of those who are alien to art. In their proximity, the enigmaticalness of art becomes outrageous to the point that art is completely negated, unwittingly the ultimate criticism of art, and in that it is a defective attitude, a confirmation of art's truth. It is impossible to explain art to those who have no feeling for it. They are not able to bring an intellectual understanding of it into their living experience. For them, the reality principle is such an obsession that it places a taboo on aesthetic comportment as a whole. Incited by the cultural approbation of art, alienness to art often changes into aggression, not the least of the causes of the contemporary de-aestheticization of art. Its enigmaticalness may be in an elementary fashion confirm a so-called unmusical, who does not understand the language of music, hears nothing but nonsense, and wonders what all the noise is about. The difference between what this person hears and what the initiated hear defines art's enigmaticalness, that difference. This is of course not restricted to music, whose aconceptuality makes it almost too obvious. Whoever refuses to reenact the work under the discipline it imposes falls under the empty gaze cast by a painting or poem, the same empty gaze that, in a sense, the art alien encounter in music, and is precisely the empty questioning gaze that the experience and interpretation of artworks must assimilate, if they are not to go astray. Failing to perceive the abyss is no protection from it. However, consciousness seeks to safeguard itself from losing its way is faithful. However, it does, is faithful. There is no answer that would convince someone who would ask such questions as, why imitate something? Or why tell a story as if it were true, when obviously the facts are otherwise and it just distorts reality. Artworks fall helplessly mute before the question, what's it for? And before the reproach that they are actually pointless. If, for instance, one responded that fictive narration can touch more deeply on the essence of historical reality than can factual reportage, a possible reply would be that precisely this is a matter of theory, and that theory has no need of fiction. This manifestation of the enigmaticalness of art as incomprehension in the face of questions of putatively grand principle is familiar to the broader context of the bluff inherent in the question as to the meaning of life. The awkwardness prompted by such questions can easily be confused with their irrefutability. Their level of abstraction is so remote from what is effortlessly subsumed that the actual question vanishes. So asking what the point of art is like asking what the point of life is. Understanding art's enigmaticalness is not equivalent to understanding specific artworks, which requires an objective experiential reenactment from within in the same sense in which the interpretation of a musical work means its faithful performance. Understanding is itself a problematic category in the face of art's enigmaticalness. Whoever seeks to understand our works exclusively through the immanence of consciousness within them, by this very measure fails to understand them, and as such, understanding grows, so does the feeling of its insufficiency caught blindly in the spell of art, to which art's own truth content is opposed. If one who exits from the immanent context, or was never in it, registers the enigmaticalness with animosity, the enigmaticalness disappears deceptively into the artistic experience. The better an artwork is understood, the more it is unpuzzled on one level, and the more obscure its constitutive enigmaticalness becomes. It only emerges demonstratively in the profoundest experience of art. If a work opens itself completely, it reveals itself as a question and demands reflection. Then the work vanishes into the distance, only to return to those who thought they understood it, overwhelming them for a second time with the question, what is it? So not what is it for, but rather, what it is. Art's enigmaticalness can, however, be recognized as constitutive where it is absent. Are works that unfold to completion and thought without, to contemplation and thought without any remainder are not artworks. Enigma here is not a glib synonym for problem, a concept that is only aesthetically significant in the strict sense of the task posed by the immanent composition of works. In no less strict terms, our works are enigmas. They contain the potential for the solution. The solution is not objectively given. Every artwork is a picture puzzle, a puzzle to be solved, but this puzzle is constituted in such a fashion that it remains a vexation, the pre-established routing of its observer. The newspaper picture puzzle recapitulates playfully what our works carry out in earnest. Specifically, our works are like picture puzzles in that what they hide, like Poe's letter, is visible and is by being visible hidden. The German language, in its proto-philosophic description of aesthetic experience, rightly expresses that one understands something of art, not that one understands art. Connoisseurship of art is the combination of an adequate comprehension of the material and a narrow-minded incomprehension of the enigma, neutral to what is great. Those who peruse art solely with comprehension make it into something straightforward, which is furthest from what it is. If one seeks to get a closer look at a rainbow, it disappears. Of all the arts, music is the prototypical example of this. It is at once completely enigmatic and totally evident. It cannot be solved, only its form can be deciphered, and precisely this is requisite for the philosophy of art. He alone would understand music who hears with all the alienness of the unmusical, and with all of Siegfried's familiarity with the language of the birds. Understanding, however, does not extinguish the enigmaticalness of art. Even the felicitously interpreted work asks for further understanding, as if waiting for the redemptive word that would dissolve its constitutive darkening. Following our works through in the imagination is the most complete and most deceptive surrogate for understanding, though obviously also a step toward it. Those who can adequately imagine music without hearing it possess that connection with it required for its understanding. Understanding in the highest sense a solution of the enigma that at the same time maintains the enigma depends on a spiritualization of art and artistic experience whose primary medium is the imagination. The spiritualization of art approaches its enigmaticalness not directly through conceptual elucidation, but rather by concretizing its enigmaticalness. The solution of the enigma amounts to giving the reason for its insolubility, which is the gaze our works direct at their viewer. The demand of our works that they be understood, their content be grasped, is bound to their specific experience, but it can only be fulfilled by way of the theory that reflects this experience. What the enigmaticalness of our works refers to can only be thought mediatedly. The objection to the phenomenology of art as to any phenomenology that imagines it can lay its hands directly on the essence is not that it is anti-empirical, but on the contrary, that it brings thinking experience to a halt. All right, so one of the things that he brings up in that paragraph I just wanted to highlight, which is an experience that I've had, which is that when I was in my initial PhD program in art history, I was shocked by just how many art history graduate students, art history professors, art history academics were actually hostile to art. Meaning they expressed their hostility to art by understanding it. Something to bear in mind. Meaning knowing a lot about something as a way of dealing with one's antagonism towards it. Alright, let's start with the notes. Cameron, Eunice, okay. That's it, yes. Cameron.
The first quote that I have, if expression is scarcely to be conceived except as the expression of suffering, Joy has proven inimical to expression, perhaps because it is yet to exist. Bliss will be beyond expression. Expression is the element immanent to art through which, as one of its constituents, art defends itself against the immanence that it develops by its law of form. Artistic expression employs itself mimetically, just as the expression of living creatures is that of pain. I chose to focus on that quote because it sort of confused me, because it basically suggests that any expression through artwork is an expression of pain, and that the expression of happiness through artwork is impossible. But I question how that can be the case.
Good. Okay, so expression and mimesis, the relationship between expression and mimesis. So we had the Erscheinung, that's the semblance or phenomenon or appearance, could also be understood in terms of expression. So an artwork doesn't represent something, rather it expresses it. So the question is how it expresses it and what that it is. So expression and mimesis, that mimesis is a form of expression, meaning when you're imitating something, you're expressing it. Now, what is this bit about pain, right? So the expression of living creatures is that of pain, meaning what do animals express? They express pain more than they express joy. So expression of suffering. Now, when we went over the immanent dialectical critique of phenomena, the idea that phenomenal forms, necessary forms of appearances that are expressions of necessity, that they are symptoms that are self-diagnosing and that are prognostical in character. So why symptoms? Right, so really the issue is suffering. So why? Why would artwork's expression be an expression of suffering? So we've had some clues in this direction. Namely, there are two kinds of suffering. There's animal suffering, living creatures, unhappiness. But then there's another kind of suffering, and that's suffering from unfreedom, meaning suffering heteronomy. So the idea is that artworks imitate, but they also try to transcend what they imitate. They imitate as a way of freeing themselves from what they're imitating. So art is a protest against reality. So artworks try to be free, and the way they try to be free is to imitate what is their condition of unfreedom. Right, so again, the mimesis isn't just the repetition of something or the representation of something or the reproduction of something, but it is also its opposite. And so by imitating, it actually becomes its opposite. So the immanence, okay. So the idea that art is both going along with the logic of things and resisting the logic of things. So that the imitation is doing both of those things. So it's imitating processes, that's what we had in Benjamin on the mimetic faculty. So imitation is a process, and generally it's a process that imitates other processes. So there's the logic of a process that's imitated, but in imitating it, one is actually objecting to it or protesting against it or resisting it. Right, so the question is, what does the expression do to the suffering? It could redeem the suffering. It could try to reverse the suffering. It protests against the suffering, but also in redeeming the suffering, it becomes the opposite of the suffering. So the artwork, basic idea that we had from last week is that the artwork in its autonomy achieves a freedom that we don't have. So it's different from Kant that way. So with Kant, the artwork is beautiful because it appears to be free the way we are free. Here, it's the opposite, which is that the artwork appears to be free in a way that we are not. And the way it does that is by imitating our condition of unfreedom, or imitating our suffering. And so this concept of expression is important because it's not just representation or communication. It is also transformative in the sense that it changes the meaning of something. But by expressing something, you're actually changing it. You're fulfilling it, but you're also changing it. And so I think that when we looked at the theological political fragment, the way Benjamin talked about nature is happiness by its total passing away, and there's only the question of passing away in fortune or misfortune, happiness or unhappiness. Right, so life is inseparable from suffering. Life is inseparable from pain. Right, so the expression of living creatures would also be their very form. Okay, so the form of life is also a form of suffering. It's a form of pain. Like Nietzsche, a little bit of Nietzsche. Every form of life is a form of suffering. Meaning every form of life suffers in its own way. So artworks are also that. Right? They're expressions of that. They are protests against that. They are imitations of that, and they are attempts to transcend that by becoming the opposite of it, but that only makes sense with respect to what it is that they're opposing. Right. Now, again, that's the issue of the law of form. The law of form. So by following the law of form, meaning each artwork follows the logic of its own form, it's both imitating its heteronymous context and able to assert its autonomy by doing that. It's doing two things at the same time. Hopefully that helped. I don't know if that explained anything. But it does, if we keep in mind what he has in mind for like what art is, and the paradox or the contradiction that art's freedom is tied to its discipline, art's freedom is tied to its following its own logic, and by following its own logic, it sort of submits to that logic. So it's the work that we do, let's put it in these terms. So nobody forces anyone to become an artist, at least not in this world. In the medieval world, yes, people were forced to become artists, actually. Did I mention this to you guys, Mozart? Okay, so Mozart, we didn't talk about that, did we? So Mozart, the pathos of Mozart is that he was a very gifted child. He was like a child prodigy musician. And because of that, his father could use him to make money. Right? So he was haunted by the idea that he wasn't like really like a talented artist and creative genius, but that he was just a well-trained monkey. So his whole life he could not separate like what made him who he was. Meaning, was he always the child prodigy who was performing for others, or was he doing it out of his own motivation and freedom? Right, the sort of pathos of that. Because, of course, he's living in the time, I guess we still live in the time where parents can certainly do that to their children, can't they? They can make them into child stars or child models or whatever they do to poor children. They can be prodigious that way. So But let's just take this as a truism. Nobody forces you guys to be artists. So it's different from other kinds of labor. It's different from other kinds of work, which are heteronymous, meaning you do it out of compulsion, out of external compulsion. Whereas you choose to make art, and yet choosing to make art is a way of protesting against heteronymous labor in which you do to yourself what otherwise society would do to you. That's the kind of contradiction or paradox that he is trying to address here. In other words, we protest against the world of heteronymous labor by imposing artistic labor on ourselves and trying to achieve freedom that way, but actually, no, it's not freedom, it's just another discipline and another misery. No? It's just a good time all the time being an artist?
No, but it's purposeful suffering.
Purposeful suffering.
It's complete, it's not, you're not experiencing the same thing.
Hopefully it's purposeful suffering. So Nietzsche is there, right? Nietzsche can be our patron saint and say, oh, it's purposeful suffering. Hopefully. I hope so. I hope we've got that consolation.
Deciding to do something is psychologically so different from being forced to do something.
It is, although when I had to just work, which I'm still working, of course, like right now, I'm on the clock, I'm on labor time. It is a compulsion, right, to survive. But when I had to work jobs that I wouldn't have otherwise chosen, I actually found it somewhat liberating because I was just told what to do and I just did what I was told to do. Whereas being in charge of your own destiny is far more daunting and scary and onerous.
Yeah, but escapism only works to a certain extent.
To a certain extent, yeah. I don't know if I could have done my whole life that way, although people do. My husband certainly does. And that's what he thinks work is. Work is being told by other people what to do. And he likes the fact that for 8 hours a day, he doesn't have to think about what to do because other people have thought about it for him. And that is his whole life, and that's fine. And the only thing that he demands in return is money. That's cool, right? As opposed to you're in charge of your own destiny, you make wonderful artworks, there's no money coming your way whatsoever.
The money is giving him the freedom to live his life the way that he wants.
Yeah.
Versus for some, that struggle is internal. So
Right.
the act of making art is providing the thing that otherwise money would get.
Right. Right. No, certainly. It's just, again, autonomy and heteronomy can't be extricated from each other. That's Adorno's point, is that they can't really be extricated. Any more than life and suffering or life and pain can be extricated from each other. They can't.
The two next quotes kind of go hand in hand with the thing sort of that I gathered that's below them. That pieces of artwork that are centered around the labor of making become hollow, just as artworks that try to escape semblance and therefore return to it. The fundamentals of artwork are inescapable, as even the attempt of trying to escape them simply reinforces their existence and omnipresence. Therefore, artwork that is not afraid or does not attempt to escape these pitfalls has a greater chance of being profound and without guarantee. Essentially, that if you try to make anything with the intention of coming at any facet of what makes artwork, then you will fail. But if you don't try, it doesn't guarantee that your work is profound, but it does greatly increase your chances of not failing.
Right. It leaves open that possibility. Right.
Yeah.
Now, again, semblance, it's connected, like I said, to this idea of expression. So, escaping semblance. So let's line up some ideas here. Imitation or mimesis. expression, appearance, phenomenon, semblance. And this is the Erscheinung. As opposed to representation. So now expression tends to imply two things. And again, we have, this is with regard to autonomy and heteronomy. So autonomy is self-ruled, heteronomy means ruled by other. And so, because he also has reconciliation. Right, so again, the autonomy of art is it's willing or chosen or free heteronomy, meaning imitation or expression. Now we'll hopefully get there. Let's put this also in terms of subject and object. So, escaping semblance means trying to escape heteronomy and achieve autonomy. But again, for Adorno, these are inseparable. And this is why this concept of mimesis or imitation is so central. So art as mimetic is supposed to transform the relation of self and other and subject and object from what it normally is. Right, so art is supposed to offer a different relation between self and other or subject and object than the ordinary relation. So how does it do that? By imitating it. Right, so the mimesis. You take a heteronymous relationship and turn it into an autonomous relationship. At least that's the idea. Now, again, if you try too hard to affect the reconciliation, then you're pretty much guaranteed to not achieve it. Whereas if you just let it happen, then it can just reproduce the existing relation. But it has some chance of transforming it or transcending it. That's the idea. The monad. Let's talk about the monad. I don't know if we've talked about the monad yet. Have we talked about the monad? Maybe not. Okay, monad. So in the Benjamin piece, mimesis, he talks about microcosm and macrocosm. So monad, or the monadological. So it's Leibniz is the philosopher and theologian who wrote a book called Monadology. And so it is Protestant Christian theology. So the idea is it's kind of like an atomic theory of matter, but in theological terms, meaning the universe is made up of monads. So all of creation is composed of monads, but each monad is all of creation in itself. So the idea is that each monad, and the term is the windowless monad. And so it refers to both matter and it refers to the soul. So each soul is a windowless monad. So its relation between outer and inner is one in which the microcosm reproduces within itself the macrocosm. And each monad is all of creation in itself. So it's a windowless monad because each monad relates to other monads, not through communication or perception, but only through the mind of God are all the monads related to each other, or all the souls related to each other. So each bit of creation is equidistant from God and infinitely distant from every other creation. Okay, monad.
So is this part of the best of all possible worlds that Voltaire was getting at for
Absolutely,
Leibniz?
absolutely. So why is that? Because everything happens for a reason, and so therefore everything happens according to God's plan, and therefore everything realizes, fulfills the potential of God's creation at all times. Because if it didn't, then it wouldn't be God's creation somehow. Right, so Voltaire attacks this idea very much. He's the model of the Professor Pangloss in Candide, right? And then the earthquake happens, and then it's well, why do earthquakes happen? Oh, God must have willed it, really? Why? How? Right? Okay. So, from Adorno's perspective, it might be that the fight between Voltaire and Leibniz is an active one, meaning one doesn't just take one side over the other. Even though Voltaire is the atheistic Enlightenment guy, Leibniz is also tied up with the Enlightenment. And actually, Leibniz, he's a contemporary of Spinoza. So he's a kind of, after Descartes, Leibniz and Spinoza are sort of both responding to Descartes in their own ways. But again, the R work is a monad, meaning that it seeks to and actually does contain within itself in its autonomy. Right? It reproduces the macrocosm, but also we could say in its heteronomy. The other concept that he'll bring in is another Benjamin. So this is all Benjamin's usage of these terms. Is the prism or the prismatic. Right, so the idea of the prism is like the it refracts. So it refracts light. And so it distills out, it takes, it sort of analytically takes apart what it draws into it. So it's another way of thinking about it. Okay, so, and the pointing beyond itself. Okay, pointing beyond itself, meaning it's entirely self-contained, and yet in being entirely self-contained, it points beyond itself. And again, that's the microcosm and the macrocosm. Another way of thinking about microcosm and macrocosm, by the way, is particular and universal. We talked about the commodity form. Yeah. Okay. So meaning, like, the particular is the particularization of the universal, and the universal is the universalization of the particular. So it moves in both directions. So why they use these terms from the history of philosophy, like monad, is with respect to, again, the commodity form. And the commodity form as reified, thingified. And that brings us back to the question of subject and object. So the idea of critical reification meaning art reifies the way capitalism reifies, but also tries to transcend that reification by imitating it. By making reification critical, by trying to give reification an autonomous character. I think this gets to maybe your last point.
Yeah. The last point was sort of like a theory of whether art would be created in a society where people are not in constant contact with each other. Like whether isolated individuals would create art, like with art. But also it's not really necessarily worth considering because we don't live in a society that is individual and isolated. So.
Right, we don't live in a reality in which we're raised by wolves or whatever myth. It's the Robinson Crusoe. It's what Marx called the Robinsonades of the 18th century, meaning that in the 18th century, people were fond of imagining, like, the human being outside of society, and Marx saw that as a symptom. In other words, a symptom of the emergence of capitalism, that we would try to imagine ourselves as if we were not in society. So Robinson Crusoe, kind of is cast away, and then he just sort of puts himself to work. He gives himself a schedule. He keeps a log of all of his activities, right? So he basically reproduces society on his own. That would be the idea, is that the desire and also the fear of being cast out, right? So we're constantly fearful of being cast out, even though we all also desire to run away and escape society. That again, it's only as members of society that we imagine such things and that we would desire or fear such things. So in that sense, again, art's existence, the social aspect of human life insofar as art tries to escape society the way we might, that's itself a product of society. That's itself an expression of society. And it's something that's very natural to us, but that would have been a little strange in previous cultures, previous time periods, in previous forms of life. It probably wouldn't have struck people the way it does for us. It's a kind of a natural, spontaneous imagination. So yeah, I mean, it's like, would isolated individuals speak? Maybe. Would they create a language, though? No. Probably not. Siblings sometimes create their own language, but that's because they're with each other.
There's a handful of interesting cases that in some of these criteria, like in regard to your communicator, which wasn't an isolated individual, but he was making all of those bajillion drawings without any indication that it was like, they were found posthumously. So, yeah, I don't know, it's an interesting case.
Well, yes.
Like he's making art, but not with any notion that it would ever be a social experience. But he's doing it obsessively with all the training that he has.
Right.
It's an interesting case.
When I'm on crit panels, sometimes, so the professors will ask, who do you imagine your audience to be? And sometimes students will say, in a very passive-aggressive way, I don't. I make it for myself. But even if you're making it for yourself, there's yourself as the audience and the self as the creator. There are those two different moments. I was teaching my social workers, my psychology social workers, my PhD students. We were looking at narrative, and it was the idea of the castaway, the diary of the castaway, and the idea of even if no one's going to read this, that you feel witnessed by virtue of writing it in a diary.
Yeah, I was going to say, I feel like when people say they do things that inherently require somebody else to view it, that they say they do it for themselves, it's not necessarily that they're doing it purely to please themselves, but to please themselves through the validation of it being perceived by somebody else. Whether the other person likes it or not doesn't really matter all the time.
Right.
But just the fact that it was perceived by somebody else validates that their self,
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
I don't know, exists or something.
Yeah, absolutely. So I think that we talked about this with Hegel, maybe. And Adorno used some of this language in the reading that we were doing in class today. Externalization, right? So the idea that art is the externalization of spirit, right? Or phenomenalization of spirit. So we can also add this here. Externalization. Right, so which is connected to objectification. Right, so it's objectified spirit, externalized spirit, so externalization of our freedom, our autonomy. Right, that we can only be free by externalizing it. That's the Hegel idea. So, we recognize ourselves through our self-externalizations. In other words, that's how it works, is that it's externalized and then realized through its externalization or through its objectification. So there's that notion that we can only develop, transform ourselves in freedom through a process of externalization or a process of objectification. Right? It has to take an appearance. It has to take a phenomenal form. It has to manifest in the world. but it has to take on the character of semblance. Right. Now, why is that? Because that's simply the way it's happened, meaning humans have achieved freedom by objectifying themselves, externalizing themselves, expressing themselves. Right, so I mentioned the forms that mark the departure from the animal world. Religion, art, language, those are all externalizations. They're also all alienations. We can add that one in there. They're all reifications. Thinifications. Where we've attributed to the externalized object our own spirit, our own freedom. So we gave to the gods what was in fact our own agency. But we had to do that because we had to externalize it in order to bring it into being. And by the way, that's metaphysics too. Right, so the other part of this section of aesthetic theory that we read, so enigmaticalness, truth content, metaphysics. So metaphysics, metaphysical objects are externalizations, they're objectifications, they're alienations, they're reifications. And yet we can't not do that. All right, so the question is, what's the status of those metaphysical objectifications? So art is a metaphysical category. It is. Meaning we don't just talk about artworks, we talk about art. Why is that? Because that metaphysical object has substance. And then the question is, what is its substance? That's what Adorno is trying to get at in this book. What is the substance of this metaphysical category of art in the era of capitalism? Right, so the metaphysical substance of art in medieval Europe was Christianity, was religion. So what is it now in capitalism? That's the question that's being addressed. So that's the point of saying that something is art or is not art. So what I mentioned earlier, like a protest demonstration, a political encampment is not art, it's politics. Politics is another metaphysical abstraction or externalization. But it has substance. If it didn't, there wouldn't be an imperative to stop it or to encourage it. The problem with cultural categories, turning everything into a cultural category, is that it creates a kind of false equivalence. Like you either you do art, or you do politics, or you do commerce, you do whatever. Right? And yet, clearly, things have their own domains. And so everything isn't just a cultural category. Everything isn't just what we call it. It's another term that he uses that we haven't, I don't know, I think in the first selection of reading, nominalism. I don't know if we talked about this, nominalism. So things are what they are simply by virtue of what we call them. Nominalism. It's just, art is just a name that we give to things? No. Nominalism originally, so that's a kind of positivistic or kind of culturally neutral way of approaching things now in capitalism. But originally nominalism was theology. It was a whole philosophical theology where each thing had its own name because each thing was a particular creation of God's. Each thing had its own not only name but law, principle, value. So nominalism. But it isn't just what we call it. Clearly things have different stakes and things function differently, even if relatedly in this context. Eunice,
I absolutely read Enigmaticalness.
which part were you looking at?
I was looking at lyric poetry society.
Lyric poetry in society. Okay. Well, it might. We started with that for a reason. We read lyric poetry in society before aesthetic theory for a reason. So let's revisit.
I'll just read this. So, on lyric poetry society, Adorno says poetry communicates personal and inner life, but he argues that inner life is also shaped by the society. So from there, I had a question about like if that's true, like can anything be personal? Do we truly have like our own opinions about things, or is it just a result of like the society which is supreme? And he also talks about self-expression. Like self-expression isn't really self-expression. It's just like, well, basically expression exists because it is expressed to the other people. So, I don't know, by reading this article, I was thinking like, do we truly really have an opinion about anything at this point? Or is it just merely shaped by the system?
So it kind of comes back to this question of would people make art if they were isolated individuals? Depends on how we understand that isolated individual. So I would say, okay, so here's what's useful about the schema, is that it's not that it isn't personal or isn't individual, it's rather always still in a context. And that can mean that it's not just as we're programmed by society, but also as we're reacting to society, as we're responding to society. So it's in relation to. So it's not an either or. I think that when we were talking about the commodity form, also we talked about the individual and the collective. And that society is both of those things. Meaning society doesn't exist without individuals, but also individuals don't exist without society, so society is always a form of individuality and a form of collectivity. So the point of like lyric poetry, especially lyric poetry as it takes a certain form, meaning the form of individual authorship in the bourgeois era and particularly in the 19th century, then that's the constitutive contradiction, which is that you use something, language, which is collective in character, to try to express something individual. So again, one wouldn't exist without the other, but that doesn't mean just adopting a collectivistic standpoint. It doesn't mean that we're just coerced by society, because the idea is that the individual is constituted in some ways in opposition to society, too. So it's not just, it's not an either or. Although we tend to think of it as an either or. But we need to reconsider the either or as something more dialectical, more contradictory, and more a matter of why it appears to need reconciliation. So the individual is produced by society, but society is also produced by individuals. It's the dialectic of individual and collective. There now appears to be more of a contradiction. Who's the famous poet whose work her work was not published, but she's like the big 19th century? Why am I forgetting her name off the top of my head? Like one of the most famous poets, but I don't think she published her poetry at all in her lifetime. I think it's all published after. Is it Emily Dickinson? I think it's Emily Dickinson, right? Emily Dickinson. So I went to school at Hampshire College, and it was in Amherst, Massachusetts, and that's where she used to live. And they had the grave of Emily Dickinson. And it was annoying because people would leave crystals on the grave. And it was kind of like, oh, that's kind of cool. Except, actually, they left the crystal, and then they'd come back and take the crystal. So the idea is that the crystal was like absorbing her poetic energy. And so that you take the crystal, and then you become a better poet somehow. I was like, oh no, this is like really, really unfortunate. Sorry. This is what I was experiencing when I was in college. Right, and these are the questions that would occur to me. Is anything personal, or is Emily Dickinson's corpse just a battery full of like poetic energy that can be absorbed by a crystal and used to juice up some other aspiring poet?
Well, it's kind of like the same idea when people talk about like Joan Didion's work and the way that she like exploited her own life in order to create artwork, and like is anything personal to the artists themselves, and when you create art, how much of yourself are you allowing to not be actually your own?
Right. Well, there's also the question of the artist as an artist, meaning, you know, I have been an artist. Is that identical with my personal identity, or is it an aspect of my personal identity? Is there a distinction between the person and the artist? I hope so. I hope so. Meaning I always thought that as an artist, I transcended my mere personality.
Because
Right.
you're allowing yourself to look at your personality, that's not your personality anymore.
Right. So even when work is extremely personal, it transcends the personal. These old ways of talking about things might still have some substance to them, might still have a point to them. Yeah. So non-identity, we talked about that, non-identity. So entity, identity, self-identity, but also self-identity having a necessary moment of non-identity. And something that we'll probably come back to, we'll be catching up on subject and object, I guess, when we get into the last section of aesthetic theory in a few weeks. Namely, in our work, trying to achieve self-identity also achieves non-self-identity or non-identity, meaning it becomes more than it merely is in another way, meaning it doesn't only realize its identity as an entity, but also transcends that entity and becomes non-identical to itself, becomes more than itself. That's another criterion of autonomy. So autonomy is meant to be transcendental. mean, the entire point of autonomy is to be more than self. Be more than itself. Or pointing beyond itself, to use the language from Hamlet's notes. All right, so have a good week off next week. In 2 weeks, like I said, we'll have our optional class session. Hope to see you guys then on the foreign and formal music. And then our final class session will be the last segment of aesthetic theory in 3 weeks.